Hi, welcome. My name is Holly. I'm a museum manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. Each month we do a historic topic, and in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month, this is about Manuel Gonzalez. I know he has a lot of relatives out there, and I'm a Yankee from New Hampshire, but he's somebody I greatly admire. And if some of you have stories you want to share, please let me know. I try to use as many primary sources as I can, but even when you're looking at newspaper clippings and ancestry.com, you'll find conflicting information. But thank you for joining me. Let's get this started. Manuel Gonzalez, founder of Fort Myers. And I wanted to mention something. I had emailed with Woody Hanson, one of his ancestors, a great, I'm not sure how many great grandchildren. And I asked him if he had anything he'd like me to say. And he said, in the sepia photo you have of Manuel is telling, zoom in on his right. That is the hand of someone who spends more time at sea than they do at port. The hand was shaped by the ropes he squeezed as he pulled up a sail on his skiff. It appears to be as rough and weathered as the canvas mailbag he carried from Key West to Tampa. And I'll tell you more about that, but I appreciated his feedback. And here we have the blockhouse of the fort. This fort was built in the 1850s. There had been a Fort Harvey. This became Fort Myers, named after Abram Myers, who had never was even actually here. And this was the blockhouse. And it was used during the Third Seminole War. And it was also reactivated during the Civil War. So keep that in mind that that's here because that plays into our story of Manuel Gonzalez. Captain Manuel Gonzalez was born in 1832 in northern Spain. He left his home in Asturias province, Spain in 1846. And I'm sorry, I tripped up over that. At 14, when students are like either in eighth or ninth grade, he traveled to Cuba with a group of young men, hoping to meet up with his brother who had gone there a few years earlier. He's leaving Spain and sailing across the ocean there. According to the story of Fort Myers, which came out in the 1950s, the ship ran onto a reef off the coast of Cuba, and a crewman swam to the shore with a rope so that the passengers and crew made their way to shore by using the rope. Manuel found his brother, then he went to Key West to obtain his pilot's license to pilot a ship. There he met Evelina Weatherford, who was born in the Bahamas in 1836. And some of the things I've read said she was of English or British extraction. They married in 1861. That's the same year the Civil War begins. In 1850, he was hired to take mail and other supplies to and from three places on Florida's west coast. He was originally in Key West. Then he went from Fort Myers and Fort Brooke, which is where Tampa is located. Manuel Gonzalez became a naturalized American citizen in Key West in 1859. During the Civil War, he traveled between Fort Brooke and Fort Myers. And this is from later on, but it shows it's a little messed up there, but it talks about him having his pilot's license. And I think this is from 1897. He will die in 1902. You can find a lot of things on Ancestry. Some people have pages that are open, or if you search, it'll give you a little story. But I will tell you that it also can give you misinformation because one of the things said that Evelina and Manuel looked like their last child was born when they were both in their 60s, which is highly unlikely. I don't think that was definitely not the correct date. And that's an old drawing of the fort. Remember, this is going to be important that we know about this fort that was there for two wars. And it was a very elaborate, with some 50 something buildings, 55, I think, in the spring of 1866. And this is quoting Manuel A. Gonzalez's son. And by the way, I've read Antonio and Antonia. So I will give you both names. In the spring of 1866, a quartet of people landed here in what was that time an abandoned wilderness. My father, Manuel A. Gonzalez, Joseph A. Weatherford, an uncle of mine, Joseph A. Vivas, a friend of our family, and myself, M.S. Gonzalez, then but 7 years of age, constituted the quartet. We arrived here in a sailing vessel. The boat returned to Key West, leaving my father and myself here all alone until the boat should return, which was about 3 weeks. So it's abandoned fort. There's nobody there. And I had done a presentation. If you're interested in knowing about the fort and Fort Myers and the Battle of Fort Myers, there's a presentation of that on our YouTube channel. It says the Battle of Fort Myers. But these are some of the pictures the iMag let me use when I did that. So you can get an idea of what it looked like in its prime. I mean, this is what we would call the River District of Fort Myers today. And this is something I think you'll find interesting. The 4 passengers in the boat wrote years later that they were not prepared for what they found in Fort Myers. The fort's once proud buildings were stripped of lumber, windows and doors. Not a living soul remained, and everything was left to the mercy of the world. Now realize they had just abandoned this the year before, they said. Gonzalez, Manuel, Weatherford, and Vivas had just sailed there, and he knew about how important this was, but everything had been ripped apart. They tied up to a pier that morning that was 1,000 feet long and was located at the end of the present-day Hendry Street. The fort occupied what is now, this was written a while ago, downtown Fort Myers. Well, it's the River District now, roughly the area between Royal Palm Avenue and Dean Street. The fort was established by the Army during the Seminole Wars, as I told you. And one of the quotes said, the young Gonzalez said that he was amazed by the condition of the buildings and wrote that all the floors in the different buildings had to be taken up and carried away. The same with all the other usable material that could be taken away heartily. Windows and doors were all gone. So imagine these just stripped. He said looters had come and axed off the doors at the hinges instead of unscrewing them. Everything was almost a wreck. Gonzalez and his father had spent the 3 weeks scouting the area surrounding the fort, clearing away some of the growth, making it ready for the arrival of others. They chose one of the buildings in the fort as a new home for the family of 10 people, Gonzalez and his wife, young Manuel, and 7 other children. But remember, they only have 3 of their own by this point. So can you imagine being there with those conditions and being there by yourself for 3 weeks? Gonzalez laid claim to the strip of land between what is now Jackson and Lee Streets, but I will follow up with what happens. And Vivas claimed the area between Lee Street and Royal Palm Avenue. And here's a census just for fun from 1870. It's really hard to see. There's a lot of census that you can find on Ancestry. And it says Manuel Gonzalez, 47. And I believe that says a seaman, and it tells he's from Spain. His wife is from the Bahamas. She was 42. And at that point, there were 3 children, and that will increase. He has 8 children. And by the way, his son, when they're there at the abandoned fort, waiting for the others to come back, which they did, Mrs. Gonzalez, Vivas brings back his fiance or his wife at that point. Let me tell you about her. Manuel and Evelina had raised an orphan from the Bahamas. Her name was Christina Stirrup, and she will marry Joseph Vivas, and they both will be 16 years old. Their first child, Manuel's, says Quimond Gonzalez, was born in 1861. They had 3 children when they arrived in Fort Myers. They went on to have 8 children. And I believe this is from the Tropicalia, or it could have been from the newspaper, from the news press, I guess. But it asked if this kind of tells you about a person of influence in Fort Myers. He's one of the first four settlers, and he was the first adult that was there by himself after the Civil War. And by the way, that fort, that's where the Union was. The Confederates were on the outside. Eventually, the Confederates had given up trying to protect that long coastline, and they were more in the center of Florida. And then this was one of the things they had posted. This, I think, was in Tropicalia. Who was this? And see if people recognize him today. There's a nice little article that you can read. You can find it if you have newspapers.com. And this says 100 years ago. It's hard to find some pictures, but it talked about the fort and what was there and how Gonzalez came there. And by the way, I don't remember if I told you, but I am in front of one of their homes, his home, their second home. And this article says that the building Gonzalez selected for his home stood on the site of the former federal building, formerly the post office, across from the Franklin Arms Hotel. These are going to end up moving, though, and I'll let you know why. It also says that Gonzalez continued to follow the sea while other settlers cultivated the soil of the former military post, growing corn, watermelon, sugarcane, and vegetables for their own use and for sale in Key West. Gonzalez was one of the best coastal pilots in South Florida, Cuba waters, and often was called on to sail in and out of Florida and Cuban ports. And this is a land grant, and this is, you can't really see it that well, but this will be signed by President Grover Cleveland. And I'll tell you why. He ends up moving to buy down where Manuel's branch is today, which happens to be named after him. Manuel Gonzalez and his son decided on an old officers' quarters building where the Sidney and Byrne Davis Center now sits. They looked for boards to complete their quarters, while Weatherford and Vivas, which I had talked about, went back to collect their families. Now remember, she had been raised by them. They're only 16 years old, the Vivases, and I really don't find it much about her brother, Weatherford. I couldn't find anything in the story of Fort Myers, and I looked for some articles. I think I'll have to do more digging. Manuel Gonzalez set up a trading post and established relationships with the nearby Seminole Indians. As other families came into the settlement, many from the Fort Thompson area near what today is LaBelle, Evelina taught the children, two of them, which were hers, with school books brought back from Key West. A couple other families settled, and eventually she would have 4 children. And this is going to be the home that they have down by Manuel's branch, and I'll explain why in just a moment. And this is another quote from Mr. Hansen. This is what he said to me in his email. Unlike pioneers who arrived in Fort Myers from the north, influenced by Oglethorpe's Georgia cattle drives and the Barbadian slave plantations, the Gonzalez family were cultural merchants who lived in the seaports in Spain, Cuba, and Florida. Their world was much bigger, and their influences were colorful, multicultural, and diverse. These were curious and industrious people who arrived in Fort Myers from the south and from the sea, a much different frontier than that which shaped those from the north. And there are the 8 Gonzalez children. And there's an obituary about Gonzalez and how he had passed away. Death of one of the first settlers and pilots from Fort Myers. And it's very, very complimentary to Captain Gonzalez. For more than a year, he had been failing and steadily losing the strength that a fine physique had given him through a long career as a seafaring man. An attack of grippe in his feeble condition rapidly brought on the end. His faithful wife and children, with the exception of 2 boys in New York, being gathered at the bedside as the spirit departed to the great harbor where no storms ever enter. Few men were better known in this portion of Florida than a Captain Gonzalez. For nearly half a century, he was identified with the history and growth of the section. And it goes on and it talks about waiting for his family all to be there for his funeral service. And then just a year or two later, we hear about Evelina's death. After an illness that had kept her confined to her bed for the past 8 months, Mrs. Manuel Gonzalez, widow of Captain Manuel Gonzalez, a proprietor of a large family in Fort Myers, breathed her last on Sunday afternoon, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Well, what happened here? What does Gonzalez do all that time? Well, he opens a trading post. He does trade with the Native Americans as well as other people. He took to the sea many, many times, and he established a home. But something is going to happen. And by the way, one thing I forgot to tell you, that young Manuel S. Gonzalez said that not only were the places damaged that were there, but as a means of defense, a breastwork of dirt had been thrown up. This breastwork was about 6 or 7 feet high and about 15 feet wide at the base. I believe it was put there during the war. Beginning at the river near the west end of the Royal Palm Hotel property, the breastwork or fort extended in a southerly direction to a point near the home of C.J. Stubbs on Lee Street. Well, who else came with the Gonzaleses? Vivas, remember, they're 16 years old. And the Gonzaleses had raised Christina Stirrup as a foster child. I don't believe they ever formally adopted her. And this tells about them, and that was from a site downtown, because that's the area their home would have been in. Joe and Anna, as they were called, Joseph and Christiana, had 9 children, 7 who survived to adulthood. Those are the other early settlers. Anna and the children were all active in the community, and Joe, who was an accomplished carpenter and contractor, as well as an experienced sailor, was elected and served on the town council in 1888. The original Vivas tract shifted as Joe parceled off pieces of what became First Street. In the early 20th century, the city of Fort Myers built a new seawall and began filling in the riverbank. That led to the creation of modern-day Bay Street and extending the Vivas tract northwards by several hundred feet. And this tells when Joseph Vivas dies in 1910. Manuel died in 1902, and I believe his wife 1904. But let me go back for a minute, or I can just talk right here. There is the gravestone of Manuel Gonzalez. Oh, she's 1905, and Evelina in the local cemetery. But what happens? Why did they move from downtown to where Manuel's branch is? This is interesting. Before the Civil War, a man named James Evans had staked a claim to that area. But what was also interesting was until 1873, he didn't formally register it. But he does come back because he leaves for the Civil War. He is a Confederate, and he serves in the Army, the Confederate Army, and he shows back up. And then he had a surveying done in 1873. And the story of Fort Myers says, Evans undoubtedly had a good claim to the land. He could prove that he had settled there first. He had cultivated the soil. He had planted a lot of trees and left because of the war. The fact that others came after he did, and remember, this is his opinion, the author of the book, not my opinion, made the others didn't make his claim less strong. He fulfilled all the requirements of the law. However, the major never went to court to get the squatters. I wouldn't call them squatters. I don't think they knew that the land, somebody had already staked a claim, and I don't even know if it was ever actually registered. He never went to court. Why he didn't is clear. Manuel Gonzalez, in telling about this phase of Fort Myers history, said, Major Anderson was a kindly disposed man, and being willing to do unto others as he would have them do unto him, which is the golden rule. A compromise was reached which satisfied all. The town plat was drawn to conform to the settlers' claims for land. That explains why the streets were laid out the way they are, sort of haphazardly. And Captain Henry wrote, the coming of Major Evans, one of the early founders of Fort Myers, was to the squatters, again, I wouldn't use that word, the realization of what they mostly feared. Being a stranger in their midst, the confiscating of the property was to their minds the thing most to be expected. But the major soon ingratiated himself with them by the kindly assurance that they would be taken care of. The heartfelt gratitude of these people caused them to hold in the highest esteem the man who allowed them to retain their homes. If possible, it's possible, however, that the issue may not have been settled as harmoniously as Gonzalez and Henry indicated. Evans may have had other reasons for taking care of the squatters, quote unquote. One old timer says he asked the major once why he didn't try to oust them, and that he replied, "Oh, I didn't want to take too many chances. I had the law on my side, but they had Winchesters." I'd like to see where all this information came from. I mean, just because it's written down doesn't mean it's true, or it could be true, but I don't think so. I don't think Gonzalez was a man that went around putting a Winchester in people's faces, just from what I've read, and that's just my opinion as well. Courthouse records show that the major got the title to the land on October 12th, 1876. Immediately thereafter, he employed somebody to lay out the town plat in Key West, because Monroe County was what we were in then, and the county seat was in Key West, a long ways away. And the major does deed a lot of the land away for little or nothing. Henry's got most of the waterfront, and Joe Vivas, who lived in the fort site much longer than anyone else, paid a higher price. A lot of people only paid $1. He paid $400. But on the entire waterfront between Monroe Street and Billy's Creek, Evans retained less than 500 feet in 4 separate strips. All the rest went to members of the Henry family. And that is when Gonzalez will move out by the creek, Billy's Creek. And that's where this home will be built. And so there's their grave site, which I hope that you'll get a chance to visit. Such brave people go to a place they've never been before, that have been virtually destroyed by the people that were there to start a new life and having to start it again. A little more about Evelina. Her obituary said she had the rightful claim to being the oldest resident in the town. She had seen Fort Myers grow from a handful of abandoned soldiers' barracks to one of the most thriving towns of the state. From the days when there was no regular mail or passenger communication, the arrival of stray mailboats being the event of a month or several weeks. I just told her story. And she started the first school. All of those people were pioneers. But imagine the father and son that were left there. And I have to say, I don't know if I would have gone if my husband wanted to move there. But they both were familiar with the area, apparently. This is the other person. Remember Vivas, a friend of theirs, 16 years old, and Christiana Stirrup, who they had raised. Vivas claimed the land just east of the Gonzalez claim. His property, deeded to him in 1877 for $400, was 100 feet wide and stretched from the river to what is today 2nd Street. And there is the home there. At the time, it doesn't exist anymore. There is a Vivas gravestone. And I have his obituary where it says, Mr. Joseph Vivas passed away after a short illness. We have a painful duty to perform this issue in the matter of announcing the death of one of our oldest and most respected citizens. And all of their obituaries are very moving and very language very much of the time. He was ever ready to help suffering humanity with sympathy and substance, never turning a deaf ear to those in need. I'll tell you a little more, but before I get to this picture, I will mention that as I'm doing research, it was said the library was one of the buildings that lasted for a very long time. But let me tell you a little more about this article. It talks about the original place that the Gonzaleses stayed in, and it said 7 or 8 rooms with a large stone chimney and so well constructed. And they talked about the 4 pupils and how Mr. Gonzalez also had so there's a school there, a storeroom where it's tobacco, beads, gunpowder, calico, and groceries. Said the Seminole Native Americans would come and trade hides for merchandise. He also kept busy running a schooner named Florida to Key West, and it would take 3 weeks to get there and back. He was also a cattleman, acted as an agent for a number of Spaniards there, and eventually they did move to out of town. But he always kept very busy. Well, when both of those pass away, their son maintains their history, and he's the one that did the writing too. And I wanted to mention this, even though he is not the person that builds this, not Manuel A. Gonzalez. We'll talk about Manuel S. Gonzalez. And this is from the Veranda Restaurant website. And if you haven't been there, I urge you to go. The Veranda has been a part of Fort Myers. This is from their website since the turn of the century, and its history has been told to us this way. In early 1850, a fort on the Caloosahatchee River was reactivated, a name from Colonel Myers. Here it says there were 57 buildings, hospital, lawns, gardens. It had a bowling alley. There were so many things there. And Manuel Gonzalez delivered supplies and mail on his sloop. And he and his son prepared a house in the fort. And this is some of the things you already knew. But this is the interesting part. Young Manuel S. Gonzalez built 2 houses at the corner of 2nd Street and Broadway. The corner house, built in 1902, was built for his mother. The second one. The first one was occupied by he and his family. The second one built for his mother. So this is the 3rd home that Mrs. Gonzalez had, and was located adjacent to the first house in what is now the Veranda's parking lot. The 2 houses were joined in the late 1960s by Peter Pulitzer, son of the publisher, for his longtime fishing buddy, Fingers O'Bannon. Paul Peden purchased the buildings in 1978 and transferred them into the Veranda. So this was built by Manuel Gonzalez's son, who was an very early settler. And there's this kitchen building was built from the second house, along with a secluded garden courtyard, now joins the 2 houses together. So her son eventually built, and he built a home for his family. He built a new one for his mother. And here's an interesting story. Just Mrs. Gonzalez dies in 1905, but this newspaper article said the ACL Railroad and Mrs. M.A. Gonzalez and children have at last come to agreement. The company offered $5,000 for this property. I think you'll recognize it. So there's another place here, but the family would not take this son, Mrs. Gonzalez. By the way, I know she did not feel it was adequate. And the railroad company would improve the waterfront next to the end. We learned from Dr. Shands this morning that Mrs. Gonzalez has agreed to accept $6,000 and that the company would be paid the sum and thus settle the matter. So that was a place that Mrs. Gonzalez owned, and they accepted it because it looked like it was not going to end up being settled. It was a very satisfactory outcome for all concerned, and it'll give the company a fine site for the depot. It was a train depot. It will become, and hasten the work as it does away with the necessity and delay of making land in the river. I guess they would have done some dredging. So then that's the train depot. It'll go on become the Southwest Florida History Museum, and today it's the Collaboratory. But Mrs. Gonzalez owned it, and $5,000 just was not going to cut it. Well, we know that Manuel Gonzalez moves, and he moves down by Billy's Creek, and there was nothing to mark the things that he did that came here. I mean, he was very familiar with this area because he had been delivering mail and supplies, but he came to virtually a wilderness where the beautiful fort had been destroyed. There was nobody else here, hardly anyone living here. They were pioneers. The first settler of Fort Myers, that was after the Civil War. And so there's the bridge there with a little plaque and a little relief of him. But that's all he has. And I think he's worthy of a lot more. People of Fort Myers, how about you? We're very grateful. And by the way, some accounts that I read said that his land at one point stretched to where some Edison property was. I don't know if this was accurate or not, but that's what I did read. And here's one more. The son of Fort Myers founder is dead. Remember, he's 5 years old along with his dad. So he's a very earliest settler. Manuel S. Gonzalez passes at the age of 75. Manuel S. Gonzalez, 74, whose father was the first Fort Myers settler, died at his home yesterday after a short illness. He was 5 years old the time his father came here. Had he lived one more day, he would have seen Fort Myers celebrate its 50th anniversary. Mr. Myers was among the 44 citizens who on April 22nd, I don't think they meant to put Mr. Myers, but Mr. Gonzalez, but that drew up the incorporation articles following the first city officials election. In point of residence, he was the oldest citizen of the city. 10 years ago, he retired from the lumber business. He was survived by 2 daughters, 4 sons, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers. And this talks about the last surviving Gonzalez grandson who died in 2014. And I think then they said they were about 100 descendants or so, but I'm sure there's very many more that can say that they're related to him. And in 2016, I know they had a reunion here. And there's Manuel S. He's buried in a local cemetery, and his wife, Irene, and he died in 1935. And what happened in the sesquicentennial of Fort Myers, declaration by Governor Scott, it says, whereas the Union Army abandoned the area now known as Fort Myers in 1865, whereas in 1846, Manuel Gonzalez left his home in Spain at the age of 14 and traveled to Florida, where he became a naturalized citizen in Key West. And whereas on February 21st, 1866, Manuel Gonzalez, his 5-year-old son, Manuel S. Gonzalez, and their friend Joseph A. Vivas, and they didn't put Weathersford here, but he was also with them, departed Key West to establish community at the abandoned Fort Myers. And whereas the settlement began by Manuel Gonzalez, Joseph Vivas, and I'd put Weatherford, and their families grew to conclude the city of Fort Myers. And whereas the Fort Myers community will join the residents of Captain Manuel A. Gonzalez to celebrate the 150th anniversary of establishing Fort Myers. And whereas Fort Myers welcomed a record 150 million tourists to our state last year, and visitors to Fort Myers can now enjoy landmarks recording the city's history throughout the celebration. Now, therefore, Rick Scott, Governor of the state of Florida, do hereby extend greetings and best wishes to all those commemorating February 21st, 2016 as Fort Myers sesquicentennial. So that tribute was given to him, and also one from the Florida House of Representatives, but that was as a PDF, so I didn't know how to get it up there for you. But it talks about him serving as a captain in a detachment that assisted the Union Army delivering mail, and says some other things, except they include Weatherford in that talk, in that declaration as well. So he did have some recognition, but I feel like the city of Fort Myers, I am not a resident of the city, but I would love to see something recognizing him as well, because he was a brave pioneer, as was his whole family. and Vivas family and Weatherford family and all of the early settlers here. And this is some of my sources. I urge you to find, there's not a lot that's written in books about Gonzalez, but there's a lot of newspaper clippings that I would urge you to check out on newspapers.com. I think he was an extremely brave man to leave Spain, go to Cuba, to Key West, and eventually end up here in Fort Myers. I can't tell you how highly I think of Manuel Gonzalez. And by the way, if you type in Manuel S. Gonzalez, you can find online, I think it's at the University of Florida, some writings that he did. He was quite a writer, Manuel S. And I meant to put that on here, but I forgot. So write in Manuel S. Gonzalez, University of Florida, and you'll find something he wrote, which is really interesting. Next month, I hope you'll join me because I'll talk about Thomas Edison and his love of baseball. And some of my baseball ones don't get a lot of people, but this is focused on Edison and baseball, not just here in Fort Myers, but overall. And I think you'll enjoy it. You might enjoy baseball history more than you think because next month we have the World Series coming up. Thank you for joining me for this talk about Manuel Gonzalez. I'll see you next month.